Welcome to Straight Outta Health IT. Getting into health tech is rough, but here's an unfiltered dialogue of healthcare leaders and influencers covering a wide variety of issues affecting healthcare and the health tech industry. And now your host, Christopher Kunney.
Hello, everyone. This is Christopher Kunney, and welcome back to another episode of Straight Outta Health IT. So happy to have you back listening to the program. And today we've got an amazing guest that I'm so excited and been wanting to have on the program for quite some time. I'll introduce her in just a second, but I wanted to just share a little bit of the topic that we'll be covering today, which I call Breaking the Barriers, encouraging people of color to participate in clinical trials. As we come out of COVID and the challenges that existed in developing a vaccine, I think one of the things that was pretty apparent is the lack of minority participation and people of color participation in some of the clinical trials. And so clinical trials are an essential part of really medical research, and they play a critical role in developing new treatments and medicines. But however, the participation of people of color in these trials is significantly lower than their white counterpart. The disparity is due to several barriers, including lack of information, cultural and language barriers, mistrust in the medical system, and a historical mistreatment of communities of color. Encouraging people to participate in clinical trials is essential to ensuring that new treatments are effective for everyone and not just one group of people. So during this episode of Straight Outta Health IT, we'll explore those barriers and that prevent people of color from participating in clinical trials, and we'll provide hopefully practical solutions to help break these barriers down. We'll also highlight the importance of diversity in clinical trials and how to improve healthcare outcomes for everyone. And who better to have on the show to talk about this is one of the leading experts on this topic. And it's a pleasure and an honor to introduce to you Dr. Jayne Morgan. So who is this amazing woman? Dr. Jayne Morgan is a cardiologist and executive director of Health and Community Education at Piedmont Healthcare Corporation in Atlanta, Georgia, the largest healthcare system in Georgia. Within this role, she serves to address health literacy and information both internally to the 35,000 employee system, as well as to external stakeholders. She previously served as the executive director of Piedmont's COVID task force, which I want to talk a little bit about that, and is a COVID vaccine expert. She's also analyzed the science and the data from Piedmont and nationally and has published 5 scientific articles on driving efforts at addressing vaccine hesitancy and increasing vaccine uptake. In doing so, she's actually created her own social media series called Stairwell Chronicles. And if you haven't listened or seen that, I highly encourage you to check it out. It's a wonderful, no-nonsense, very practical analysis of some of the challenges and intricacies that are facing healthcare today. She breaks it down to layman's terms, so I encourage you to check it out. She's got an amazing resume and a number of awards, too many that I don't really have time today to go through each and every one, but I do want to highlight a few of them. Dr. Morgan is the recipient of several awards acknowledging her work and providing accurate science and medicine to all communities, including the NAACP Award, National Women's Empowerment Award, the Atlanta Business Chronicle Award, and the Medical Association of Georgia Humanitarian Award. Further, she actually serves as a medical expert for CNN. So if you haven't seen her, and I'm sure many of you probably have seen her on CNN, she's been an amazing resource for them. And again, really breaking down some of the complexities associated with vaccines and a number of other healthcare-related topics. She's an adjunct professor of medicine at Morehouse School of Medicine and was selected to support the Department of Health in its series of Ask the Experts, and has been a diligent and longtime advocate for health equity for all communities. And she further serves on the board of Georgia Bio, the Medical Association of Atlanta, and the National Board of the American Heart Association Diversity and Inclusion. If that wasn't enough, and I don't know when this woman finds time to sleep, she is published in areas of congenital heart disease, interventional cardiology, and COVID-19. She serves as health equity advisor for Moderna and is on the steering committees of both Pfizer and Novartis, where she serves as the national lead of the Horizon trials. Previously, she's also served as chief medical officer of American Chemistry Council, cardiology advisor to MetroClip team at Abbott Labs, the Global Director of Cardio-Renal Division of Solveig Pharmaceuticals, Associate Professor of Medicine at the Cleveland Clinic, and the first African-American president of Southeast Life Science Association, the single largest bio association in the Southeast. And in her spare time, which I probably think is like an hour, she's a Pilates enthusiast and she holds several Pilates certifications. So without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Jayne Morgan. It's such a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Oh my gosh, Chris, thank you. And thank you for such a wonderful introduction.
You're very welcome. Oh my God. I just feel like I need to step my game up. This woman has done so much in her short period of time on this planet. And we thank you for your service and your advocacy, and so excited to have you today to talk about this very important topic.
Let's jump in.
Wonderful. But before we start, I always ask, I guess, the resume tells your journey, right? Your broader journey, but doesn't really tell the story of who Dr. Jayne Morgan is and what drove her to become a physician and what encouraged her to now advocate for things like clinical trials and health equity. If you would just spend a few minutes and share with our audience your journey into healthcare, what inspired you, and why you now have taken up this mantle around health equity.
And you know what, Chris, that is such a great way to put it. Your bio tells your journey, but it doesn't tell your story.
Right.
Wow, I love that. And my story really encapsulates ongoing learning and evolution. So I'm a cardiologist. I wanted to be a doctor for a long time. I went to medical school, became a doctor, and then did my internal medicine residency, but I really didn't know anything about cardiology or critical care. And I went to actually medical school and thought, oh, you know what? I'll be an orthopedic surgeon. Mm-hmm. And I probably thought that because we had a couple of neighbors who were orthopedic surgeons. That's what I knew about medicine. When I got there, I started to be exposed to so many things. So there was psychiatry and rheumatology and all these things I had never heard of.
Exactly.
And so I decided to specialize generally in internal medicine because I was just undecided. And in that internal medicine training at George Washington University, we had a required critical care rotation. And I really loved it. I loved all the ICU work. And then I did cardiology, really liked cardiology. And so it was a matter of growing within your field and exploring. There wasn't anyone leading me or advising me, or there wasn't a doctor. I had PhDs in my family, but there was not a medical doctor. So there was no one kind of showing me the path. And I was just open to learning and exploring along the way. And that's how I ended up in cardiology. Had no idea of cardiology when I went to medical school.
Sure. Just a little bit of a trailblazer.
Just a little bit of learning. Oh, I like this. Oh, I never heard of that. Oh,
yeah, let me try that.
And I think that has in many ways marked my career. And my career has been tangential. I'm a medical doctor, I'm a cardiologist, but then I went into research. I was at Solveig Pharmaceuticals and Abbott. And how did that happen? That was really just a life change. I was getting a divorce. My husband at the time was a neurosurgeon.
Sure.
I was a cardiologist. I wasn't sure how I was going to raise 3 kids and still be a cardiologist, and was just open to change. Had an opportunity at Solveig Pharmaceuticals. They hired me as a safety officer, I think.
Right.
I took the job. I didn't even know what that was. I had no idea what a safety officer was. And just to be clear, I had some precedents. I had a couple of friends I had trained with who were in industry, and they really enjoyed the pharma and device industry. You know, and you're probably reeling from the divorce and you're trying to get yourself stable. I really didn't give much thought to it. Fine. If you guys think I'll do it, I can do it. I'll do it. And that's really how I learned about research. And then I began to get drawn further and further down into research and really liked it. Was writing clinical trials, was doing these things, all these things I'd never heard of, doing them and learning them and moving along in them. And so then came to Piedmont to lead their research program. And then innovation. I started to get involved in all the technology and biotech. And
which is where I met you when you were.
That's right. I was starting to do that on the side. So my whole role has been just continuing to just explore, oh, what's over here? Oh, what's over here? And so it's just continued to add to my resume. And then, of course, COVID hit. And I like to say I was minding my own business like everybody else when COVID hit. And I
Sure.
was redeployed to have this role leading the COVID task force. And that morphed into a lot of communication, a lot of education, and leveraging a lot of those skills that I had used for a couple of decades,
Right.
giving lectures and grand rounds and running internships and teaching students from high school to college to medical school, teaching them science, oftentimes one-on-one or maybe just 3 or 4 people. But that was honing those skills. of
Sure.
speaking and teaching people where they are in their education path and making certain. And so that morphed more into communication and then into media. And so this is where I am now. So there was no straight path. The willingness to live in a gray zone,
Right.
have things swirl around you,
Yes.
not really sure where you're going to land or where all these objects around you are even going to land or if they're going to hit you.
And we were talking earlier before we started recording, making lemonade out of lemons, taking situations
Well put.
and turning them into something that can be a positive experience. And like you, I get asked a lot about, my trajectory and my path. And was it a conscious decision in terms of the things that I've done? I would say some were, but many were not. It was how do you take advantage of the circumstance that you're in and make the best of it as well, too. And I loved your story as well, too. And thanks for being transparent and sharing even the personal aspect of what drove you into some of the decisions and opportunities that you pursued as well.
And sometimes it's not even, for me, I guess you're right. Maybe I took advantage of the opportunities, but the fact of the matter was the opportunities weren't clear to me at the time. And I think I was sometimes a little bit more in survival mode. I was just surviving. You're in that survival. I was not only taking advantage of opportunities, I was creating opportunities.
Exactly. And
because I had to
thriving from it.
move and pivot and drive and figure out how I was going to stay on my feet. And so in that was growth as well. But growth can be painful. Let's be clear.
Yes, it is. Absolutely. It definitely can.
Growth can be scary. Growth can be painful.
Exactly. And we could literally do a whole podcast on just that whole topic, which I will
growth.
bring you back on and we'll
Right.
have that conversation as well.
Have
How you
that
survive
conversation.
life.
Acquiring survival skills along
That's
the
right.
way that become career skills.
That's right.
When they were happening, they were survival skills.
Exactly.
Right.
I mean, even starting this podcast, again, I don't want to get too far off topic, was a survival skill. It was trying to promote a company's business and encouraging them to try to do more social media and decided to show them how to do it.
Right.
And it blossomed into what we're doing today. But I want to go down that path. I do want to stick on our subject.
Okay. All right.
I want to talk about the importance of diversity in clinical trials. In clinical trials, as we stated earlier, are an important part of drug development process as it helps researchers determine the safety and efficacy of new treatments. However, historically, people of color have been underrepresented in these trials. This is problematic because it can lead to drugs being approved that may not be as effective or as safe for those populations. In addition, it perpetuates health disparities as certain groups may not have access to the latest treatments and technologies. I want you to share your perspective on the current state of clinical trials and why in 2023, pharma and research still have gaps in representation of people of color in their clinical trials.
I actually did a series of Sterile Chronicles this week. And if you all have never followed them, credit to them. This is where I literally sit on the stairs of my house. That's my house. Those are my steps. Those are my clothes. And I talk just for 60 seconds about a specific topic from beginning to end. It's just 1 minute long. And last week I did a series on health equity, 5 different segments. And I talked about the topic of that was health equity. Health inequity is me. And you may not think that health inequity is me. I'm a cardiologist, work for a big health system. We know that, she's talking about health equity, but it doesn't really pertain to her. So I did a series to talk about that. The 5th part of that series last week, if you go and watch it, you can follow me on Instagram or Twitter or wherever you want to find me at Dr. Jayne Morgan, it's Jayne, is I talked about clinical trials and how here I am in research. I spent 20 years in research. I've written clinical trials. I write protocols. I advise major companies on inclusion and exclusion criteria. And yet I've never been offered a clinical trial by any of my doctors. And the reason for that is the data shows that if you see a white physician, you are unlikely to be approached to enter a clinical trial. And if you are seeing a Black physician, that physician is unlikely to be approached by a pharma or device company to lead a trial.
Wow.
And here I am in the gap, falling through the cracks as a cardiologist, as a clinical researcher, have never been offered a clinical trial.
And you're part of the system.
And I'm part of the system.
Right.
And this is how the system works.
Right.
And so even someone like me who is turning and a part of the system is not a part of health access and equity. And so if you get a chance, go through and listen. Every single day, I talk about how health inequity is me. And this is why we have these disparities. The number one reason that people enter clinical trials is that they are approached by a trusted physician. 80% of African Americans are seen by African American physicians, right? We take care of our community. There's cultural congruence. Only less than 2% of all clinical trials have principal investigators that are African Americans. These are the people who are leading the trials.
I can't believe it. I can't believe it.
80% of the population is excluded because we don't have access. If the number one reason is you have to be approached by a trusted physician, that's any race and any culture. You're approached by a trusted physician, but your physicians are excluded.
I don't even know these trials exist.
There you go. So here you are. You become a Dr. Morgan. You see a white physician, you're not going to be offered. You're less likely to be offered a clinical trial. If you're seeing a white physician, you see a Black physician, they are less likely to be offered opportunities from drug and pharma companies.
That's amazing. Again, in this day and time where we talk about diversity and inclusion as a part of our normal conversation today, and thank God that we are having these discussions, that pharma still doesn't recognize the real value of that, or still struggling to recognize the real value of that, and not tapping into this very rich market of clinicians who can be the conduit to get access to people of color in those communities. So that's unfortunate, but I applaud you for bringing the awareness to it. And if you haven't listened to Steroid Chronicles and this series, I encourage you to do it. I actually have, which is why I asked her to come on, because I wanted to talk about this on my show as well, too. Not to mention that obviously this institutionalized lack of awareness or commitment to including us in the trials exists. We ourselves actually have our own challenges and issues about participating in clinical trials as well. I mean, there's been historical reasons for distrust in clinical trials amongst people of color and are rooted in long and painful histories of medical exploitation and unethical experimentation. For example, we all hear about the Tuskegee Syphilis Study conducted from 1932 to 1972, when African-American men with syphilis were left untreated and lied to about their health conditions, while researchers continued to study them and tried to learn the impacts of the disease on that community. Or in the mid-1900s, when Puerto Rican women were subjected to sterilization procedures without informed consent as a part of eugenics programs supported by the U.S. government. So we've had these institutionalized atrocities that have happened within communities of color. I'm just curious, from your perspective, could you maybe expound on some of those for people who may not be aware of these types of atrocities that have occurred, your thoughts and insights on the U.S. healthcare system's complicitness to a lack of trust in the system?
And so those are all valid reasons, right? And I give lectures on this and I don't mince words. We have no reason to trust the health system. And I'm a part of the health system, right? Because of historical context. History matters. History is important. This is your experience. How do you experience life? How does your family experience life? How do you experience America? Right. Not what are the laws, what are the rules? How do you experience it?
Exactly.
Regardless of what the laws are. And so absolutely, people will step away. Certainly Black people will step away from research. And we also step away from the health system. We have a very—
I was going to say, just even primary care.
That's right. With the health systems. And again, I give talks on, maybe that's for good reasons. We have so many medical formulas, algorithms, devices, practices that are race-based.
Right.
that take into consideration, if you are Black, then you take this path.
Right.
If you are white, then you take another path. And you can imagine the path that you take if you are Black somehow always leads to a lower level of care and concern.
Right.
And this is baked into the system. These are actual medical formulas and things that we follow. So we've got a lot of work to do.
Exactly.
One of the things that's, maybe very salient for today, on May 11th, 2023, the public health emergency for COVID is ending.
Right.
And one of the things that is probably going undiscussed is that many of the subsidies during COVID went a long way in closing the health equity gap. For the first time, we saw Blacks having access to some of the same things and having access to some of the same medications and having additional funding in their homes that allowed people to have their ends be met.
Exactly. Food deserts and being able
That's
to
food deserts, pharmacy deserts. Not only that, it was important for clinical trials.
Right.
We began to see more and more people being enrolled in clinical trials that specifically related to vaccines and COVID, as people had more and more information during this public health emergency about COVID and were now willing to ask questions and be enrolled in some of these trials. And so I'm concerned, as the public health emergency ends, that connectivity that we had, at least with COVID trials, will also begin to wane as people, unfortunately, go back to business as usual. We go back to that normal was not good for us. And as we go back to normal at the end, as we end this public health emergency, that also could portend some mitigation or some dampening of our participation in clinical trials, just as we were starting to ramp it up, at least with COVID trials. So it's a point to be made. Now, I would just say this, and we're a little bit off topic because I don't want to.
No, please. No, this is important.
Right. The Department of Health and Human Services has implemented a bridge program. And so supplies, our stockpile, the United States government, and access will still be available through 2024. So it doesn't just cold turkey stop today. The actual declaration stops today, and we begin to now eat into our stockpile and our access, which still should take us through 2024. But we need to get ready for what does that look like.
Right. So after 2024, does that mean if I wanted a COVID vaccine, I now
pay $100 or $130, right?
Okay.
Or healthcare is not equal in America either. Depends on what type of insurance you can afford. You got a commercial carrier may cover it as preventive medicine, like your flu shot. Or you may have a copay, depending on what other type of insurance you have. So more bells and whistles you have, the less impacted you will be by the cost. The fewer you have, the more you will have to absorb the cost. That's the oxymoron of our health system. If you can't afford a higher level insurance, then you have to pay more.
Right. Then you have a lower value insurance.
Right. There you have it. That's another podcast.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for those who may not have been aware that today that those changes happen and what the impact will be over the next year or so for our access to vaccines as well, too. So I appreciate that.
Vaccines and other therapies. So the Paxlovid, home testing, all of that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's important. So all of that means it's got to come out of our pocket.
Now, the clock starts today.
And I did want to circle back and just acknowledge also, I think it's important for researchers and healthcare professionals to acknowledge this history of mistreatment of people of color and
atrocities.
Yeah, atrocities. Thank you. Yes, resulting in the mistrust.
Torture.
Absolutely. And that we need to figure out how to build this trust back in our communities. And that we can only do that through things like outreach and cultural sensitive communication and transparency and having people that look like ourselves be a part of the process. And so I want to delve into a little bit of the benefits, too, of clinical trials and why we should be a part of that. I mean, there are obviously numerous benefits for being a part of this. It ensures that these trials are applicable to a wider range of people and includes all groups of people so that it's not just driven by results predominantly created by white men or other majority groups. And then I also would just be curious from your perspective, what are some of the other values and reasons why we should participate in these programs?
No, absolutely. And you've already alluded to it. We have to think about clinical trials. We're designing clinical trials. This really represents our best and our brightest thinking. This is how you get access to tomorrow's medications today. Let's think about back when Donald Trump was president of the United States and he contracted COVID, one of the earlier variants that were much more deadly than Omicron.
Right.
He was sitting in the White House, desaturating, meaning his oxygen levels were dropping. All of the medical community understood elderly, overweight man, positive with COVID, oxygen levels dropping. What happened? He was airlifted to Walter Reed Hospital. We don't all have that access to get a helicopter ride directly to the hospital. Let's talk about access.
Exactly.
So he got access to Walter Reed Hospital. When he got there, the very first thing that we understood, that I listened to their news briefs that were very short on information. But what I did hear was that Donald Trump received immediately an infusion of monoclonal antibody therapy. Now, monoclonal antibody therapies were not available at that time. They were only available within clinical trials. The only people who had access to them were those who were enrolled in clinical trials here in the United States. Donald Trump was eligible, apparently, because he was able to get emergency use authorization because of the importance of his role. And outside of the trial, he was provided access to monoclonal antibody therapies. Monoclonal antibody therapies are credited with interrupting the downward spiral and trajectory of his disease process. Make no mistake, he was in trouble.
And because he was president, because he had access, he was able to get the most latest treatments.
Not even the latest, it's not even out yet. Don't you want access like that?
Yes, absolutely.
That's what clinical trials provide. Clinical trials provide tomorrow thinking to you today. It is platinum level care. It is when you see your physician treats you to the top of evidence-based medicine, the best medications possible and available. But clinical trials offer you not just the best, they offer you maximum therapy. It's like a reserve. You can go to the top, but then there's a reserve that only a few people can tap into. Why would we exclude ourselves from that reserve? And then the last thing that I will say is oncology trials. Cancer trials, very specifically, have been shown that if you enroll in a cancer trial, not the subsequently approved chemotherapeutic agent or whatever the cancer treatment may be, just enrolling in the trial, you have an increased rate of remission of your cancer just by participating in the trial and getting access. Is that of value to you? Another week of your life, another month of your life, another year of your life, just by participating in the clinical trial? Is that not of any value to you? And then the last thing that I would say is in these oncology trials that predominantly enroll white men, later, these same chemotherapeutic agents are applied to the Black population with an increased rate of colon cancer, increased rate of prostate cancer, increased rate of GI cancers. We're the ones with the increased rates of cancer, but we didn't participate in the trials for the therapies that now predominantly are going to be used on us. Come on, we got to think about this. We got to move beyond exploitation towards representation and understanding our power and what is needed to have really good healthcare and health equity. Clinical trials begin to close that gap on health equity. This is how you get access to your medications that you cannot afford. You enroll in clinical trials, and by and large, the drug companies will comp all of your medicines during the time that you're in the trial.
So you're getting treatment and not having to come out of your profit for it.
What about that?
That's it. I say, where do I sign up? Exactly. And I just want to also be clear. No one's saying we should exclude the majority population from participating in these trials. They
No, we're
obviously
saying you should be included.
That's correct.
And make certain that you understand, not diminishing anything that has happened to us in the past,
Exactly.
but also understand that clinical trials can be a ticket to better healthcare.
There you go. There you go. Absolutely. So let's talk about how do we then increase participation of people of color in clinical trials? I know, how do we build trust and increase awareness? What are some of the practical things we can do to start to bend that curve in a positive direction for people of color to be more involved in these programs?
So many layers of that onion.
I know, right?
Only a 30-minute podcast.
I know, right?
I will start. We need to have people that look like you and I running these trials. So first of all, we need to recruit and train principal investigators. These 80% of physicians, these physicians who are seeing 80% of the population who are out in the community, who
Sure.
have cultural congruence, who are dedicated and have these trusting relationships, they have got to be involved in these clinical trials and leadership roles. Secondly, at study sites like Piedmont and other places, you have got to have leadership, Black people in leadership in research, not in mid-level roles, who can make decisions and such that others can look to them and understand that this is something that is safe and available and accessible. And then you also need populations of color at all levels of research, such that when you're interacting with the patients, there is cultural congruence. You are speaking a language and a body language that people understand and trust, and they know that you understand them by just small gestures and inflections that are not learned. They are inherent in your culture. That's cultural congruence.
Exactly.
And so there are many, many layers of this. And then finally, what I spend time doing advising these companies is got to be baked into the pie. Right. At the time that you have decided that you are going to move a compound from the pipeline through drug development process, that's the time to begin to identify study sites, identify physicians, write your protocol, write your inclusion criteria with this access in mind. How are we going to include all kinds of different populations? And let's think about that from the beginning and not try to scramble and patch it together at the very end of a phase 3 trial. Let's think about it in our phase 1 trial and have some thoughtful deliberation and selection and identification of what we need to do to go forward to build an infrastructure to make sure that this is baked into the pie.
Absolutely. And then how do we get, community involvement in that? Community leader, churches, civic organizations, and other groups who might have an influence that people in those communities trust and seek their insights and knowledge about all aspects of their life.
Yeah, absolutely. All of those are important. And make no mistake, we need conduits and people who can do the handoffs. But we also have to begin to have these direct dialogues with our physicians.
Sure.
And not necessarily rely on community leaders. Have a relationship with your doctor.
Right.
Don't have a doctor. Let's figure out what it's going to take for you to have a relationship with your doctor. That's how access begins.
Right. And sometimes it's a one-way conversation, quite honestly, with doctor and physician and patient, where the doctor's telling the patient things, but the patient's not asking the doctor.
Or the patient's not taking it in. You've got to be able to take it in. So you've got to find the person who's the fit for you. We talk about food deserts. We talk about pharmacy deserts. There are doctor deserts too, where there's not even a doctor around. So all of these things need to come into place. But these are really good questions. There's so many layers to this onion, but we've got to begin to have a relationship and a conversation with the healthcare system. And if that means having a relationship with the healthcare system with people that look like you and I, then so be it, so we can be that bridge. But understand, there are also not that many of me either. There are not that many Black female cardiologists, like less than 1%.
I create a pipeline,
rare, right? This is very rare. but it doesn't mean that you can't find them and you seek them out. And certainly in this era of virtual worlds and telehealth, your access might be broader to find that person that speaks to you in the way that you like to communicate and see if you can begin to understand and learn this information firsthand.
Right.
So I'm not denigrating our community advocates because they are often very good and very critical, but that still becomes second and third hand information.
Exactly.
Which is okay if that's the best that we have, but I want you to start to think about getting it firsthand.
Right.
In that relationship.
We're going to have to leave it there. As I expected, the time would fly by. I am going to have you back on,
okay,
to continue to peel back the layers and this and other issues that affect our community as well. I want to thank you so much for taking time out your very busy schedule and I wanted to see if you had any final thoughts you want to share with our listeners as we bring this episode of Straight Outta Health IT to a close.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one of the biggest travesties that has come out of COVID has been people following on social media people that they like and not understanding that you're following people that you like for other reasons. They're a celebrity, they build cars, but all of a sudden you're following them for COVID advice and medical advice because you like them. That's what we're talking about, that trust factor. You trusted them, but you didn't make the transition to saying, but should I trust them on this specific topic?
Exactly.
Right?
Are they experts?
Right? If you go to an Italian restaurant, you don't order Chinese food. That's not where you're going to get the best Chinese food.
Right.
So that being said, I'm going to say, if you're looking for an expert, follow me on social media. It's Dr. Jayne Morgan, DrJayneMorgan. And that is on Instagram, Twitter, at YouTube, at LinkedIn. Follow along. I only talk science. Talking science all the time, but it's scientific information from someone with a scientific background. Don't follow me for your cooking show. I don't do cooking, but I do science. You need to begin to parse that and follow specific people for specific levels of expertise.
Absolutely. And I can tell you personally, I get my information. She is my source of truth. And I can tell you, she speaks plainly about it based on scientific studies, research, data. It's not her personal opinion. It is what the facts are. So I highly encourage you also to seek her out, follow her, and you won't regret learning more about the things that she's sharing as well, too. So thank you.
Thanks.
For the show. I'm so excited to have you here, and I'm going to have you back as well. That's it. Another episode of Straight Outta Health IT has come to a close. I want to thank all the listeners again for taking time out of their busy schedules to tune in and join us. And your comments and feedback are always welcome and encouraged. So please share your thoughts on this episode or any of our past episodes as well. Thank you for your support. I wish you guys great health, high spirits, and look forward to seeing you on our next episode. Take care and God bless.
Thank you so much for listening to Straight Outta Health IT. We hope you enjoyed today's guest. For more unfiltered dialogue of healthcare leaders and influencers, be sure to tune in next week. For the show notes, transcripts, and resources, please visit Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite streaming platform. We invite you to give us feedback by reaching out to Christopher Kunney on LinkedIn, just searching for Straight Outta Health IT, and you'll find us. We are constantly having live discussions about diverse topics in the industry.